1.3 Cardiovascular System Assessment, Edward Sayers. We use the cardiovascular system to complete most aspects of our daily lives. As you can see in this diagram, there are 4 main areas where we called upon the cardiovascular system to help us. These 4 areas include the transportation of blood, carrying myoglobin and oxygen around the body, exercise, and resting. These are just 4 of the numerous jobs our cardiovascular system helps our body to do. There are several functions our cardiovascular system completes within our bodies. In this diagram you can see 5 functions of the cardiovascular system. Again, the transportation of blood, thermoregulation, clotting, and protection from infection, and lastly, removal of waste products. These are crucial jobs executed by the cardiovascular system. The transportation of blood is an obvious function because the heart needs to pump blood around the body filled with red blood cells containing both oxygen and myoglobin. Secondly, thermoregulation. Our cardiovascular system is responsible for controlling the temperature of our bodies. As you can see, if our cardiovascular systems weren't efficient at doing this job, our species would be short-lived. Our cardiovascular system can vasodilate, which means to expand, and vasoconstrict, which means to get smaller, the blood vessels within our bodies. We will see more about this later in the video, but for the time being, this is how the cardiovascular system keeps control of the temperatures within our bodies. The cardiovascular system helps with both clotting and protection from infection. However, first we will talk about clotting. The cardiovascular system helps with clotting because the heart pumps around the body blood which contains platelets. These platelets in our blood form over open wounds to create scabs. This collaboration of platelets form over the wound and these prevent infections. Now we move on to protection from infection. White blood cells in our body contain antibodies which help fight infections. White blood cells also ingest pathogens to keep our bodies fit and healthy and to help our bodies avoid from getting damaged by infections or illnesses. The cardiovascular system consists of 2 types of circulations. Firstly, you have the systemic circuit. This transports oxygenated blood from the heart and then round the body by diffusing, being distributed by different types of blood vessels. And then secondly, you have deoxygenated blood, which carries blood filled with CO2 and other waste products back up to the heart and then back up to the lungs to be reoxygenated. First we will talk about the systemic circuit. This starts with a pulmonary vein transporting newly oxygenated blood down to the left atrium in the heart from the lungs. Then the blood travels through the whole cardiac cycle, which we will look at later, and then out of the top of the heart via the aorta. Once in the aorta, blood then branches down into the arterioles and that are connected to the aorta. This helps with the distribution of blood around the body. Once in the arterioles, the blood then passes through the capillaries, where a gas exchange will take place. This will remove most of the oxygen being carried by the red blood cells. Now we can move on to the pulmonary circuit. This circuit starts off where the systemic circuit left off. The pulmonary circuit starts after the gas exchange in the capillaries. The blood then moves on into the venules. However, at this point there is barely any force being generated from the heart. So instead of the blood being pumped through the blood vessels like they do in arteries, blood now runs at a much slower pace. Once the blood is in the venules, the blood then travels into either superior or inferior vena cava, depending on its location, and then the vena cava transports the blood, sometimes against the force of gravity, we will cover more on this later, back to the heart. Once back at the heart, the blood then travels through the cardiac system, just like it did in the systemic circuit. However, instead of travelling into the left atrium via the pulmonary vein, the blood travels back into the heart either through the superior or inferior vena cava into the right atrium. Once the blood has passed through the cardiac cycle system, the blood then comes out of the heart via the pulmonary artery and then up to the lungs for the blood to be reoxygenated to allow the process to repeat itself. The systemic circuit then starts again because once the blood has been reoxygenated in the lungs, the blood then travels back into the pulmonary vein. Now we can move on to the structure of the heart and its actual function. To start off, you need to understand that the heart has three layers: the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. The epicardium is the inner layer of the pericardium, a conical sac of fibrous tissue that surrounds the heart and the roots of the great blood vessels. The myocardium is the muscular middle layer of the wall of the heart. It is composed of contracting cardiac muscle fibers, which allow the heart to contract. Lastly, the endocardium. This is the thin inner layer of the heart. This layer lines the inner heart chambers, covers the heart valves, and is continuous with the endothelium of large blood vessels. Just a bit more information on the pericardial or the pericardial sac. As you can see below, it is a double-walled sac. It consists of two layers, one a fibrous layer and a serous layer, and lastly, it surrounds the pericardial cavity. The heart consists of 4 valves. These valves are used during the cardiac cycle. The 4 types of valves are the bicuspid and the tricuspid valves found at the bottom of the atria and the top of the ventricles. The tricuspid valve has 3 parts to it, as you can see in the diagram, and as expected, the bicuspid valve only has 2. The aortic valve found in the aorta, and lastly, the pulmonary valve found in the pulmonary artery. The diagram shows what each valve looks like and where they are in the heart. These valves are designed so that it can't open to allow blood to flow back through. They are designed to prevent backflow. Most of these places where the valves are found, blood is having to work against the force of gravity, so the valves are there to help the blood get around the body to where it needs to go. When you look at the heart, you can see it is separated by lines of tissue. As you can see in this image, the two pieces of tissue that make these 4 areas are called the interatrial septum and the ventricular septum. This image clearly shows the ventricular septum and the atrial septum, which is helpful when trying to learn their locations and functions. Their main function is to separate the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Now we can move on to the cardiac cycle. We've spoken about this briefly earlier on in the video. However, we didn't talk about it in much detail, but now we need to further our understanding of it. We start off the cardiac cycle with diastole. Diastole is the part of the cardiac cycle where the heart is refilling with oxygenated blood. Ventricular diastole is the period which the ventricles are filling and relaxing with oxygenated blood, while atrial diastole is the period where the atria are relaxing. During atrial diastole, the pressure in the left and right atria increase as the bicuspid and tricuspid valves open because of the high levels of pressure caused by the filling of blood. Diastole takes approximately 0.5 seconds to be completed. Systole is the part of the cardiac system where the atria contract. When the smaller upper atria chambers contract in late diastole, they send blood down to the larger lower ventricle chambers. When the lower chambers are filled and the valves to the atria are closed, the ventricles isovolumetrically contract, and this is the first stage of systole. The second phase of systole sends blood to the left ventricle to the aorta and body extremities, from the right ventricle to the lungs. Systole takes approximately 0.3 seconds to be completed. Contractions are caused when an impulse is sent from the sinoatrial node to actively contract the left and right atria, to make sure that all the blood is transferred into the left and right ventricles. Once all the blood is pushed through, the impulse then travels to the atrioventricular node, down the bundle of his, down to the bundle branches, and finally up the Purkinje fibers. Once at the Purkinje fibers, the impulse causes the ventricles to contract, which pushes the blood up and out of the heart through either the pulmonary or aortic valve. Relaxation periods do happen within the cardiac cycle. They are when the top chambers in the heart, the atria, passively fill with blood. At this point, the heart is relaxed and is under no contraction. This resting time is approximately 10 milliseconds long between each contraction. The time it takes for the heart to complete a full cardiac cycle is approximately 0.8 seconds. Diastole takes approximately 0.3 seconds and systole takes around 0.5 seconds. However, these times do vary depending on the person. These stats are just averages. The average heart rate for a person is 72 beats per minute. Then divide this 72 by 60 and this makes 0.8. So this shows the average time of completion for the cardiac cycle is around 0.8 seconds. This is an overview of the cardiac cycle. So to start off, the right atrium fills with deoxygenated blood and the left with oxygenated blood. And then once the pressure in the atria, both the left and right atria, become too great because of the increase in volume of blood, then the bicuspid and tricuspid valves open, allowing 70% of blood in the atria to passively flow through into the ventricles. Because the atria are still filled with 30% of this blood, an impulse needs to be sent from the sinoatrial node in the right atria to actively fill the ventricles by making the atria contract, pushing the remaining 30% of blood out from them and into the ventricles. With all the blood now in the ventricles, the impulse can travel to the atrioventricular node, down the bundle of His, down to the bundle branches, and then up the Purkinje fibers. Once it has travelled up the Purkinje fibers, the impulse then contracts and pushes all the blood out through the top of the heart, through either the pulmonary or aortic valve, and that's the cardiac cycle. Here is an image that explains what I just said again, so if you're confused, just pause the video here and look at this diagram. Now we can move on to talk about how the conduction system controls the cardiac system. The conduction system controls the cardiac system. The conduction system is responsible for controlling our cardiac system, and it does this in 4 stages. The first stage is called atrial distole, and as seen before, this is the passive filling of the atria with blood, coming from either the pulmonary vein or superior or inferior vena cava. The next stage is atrial systole, which is where the impulse is sent from the sinoatrial node and forces the atria to contract, squeezing out the other 30% of blood that is still in there, out of the atria and into the ventricles. The third stage is ventricular diastole, which is where the passive filling of the ventricles happens. Once the pressure has built up in the atria because of the increasing volume of blood in them, the bicuspid and tricuspid valves are forced open, allowing blood to passively pass through them into the ventricles. This stage is called ventricular diastole. The last and fourth stage is called ventricular systole. This happens once the impulse has travelled through the atrioventricular node, down the bundle of His, to the bundle branches, and then up the Purkinje fibers. The impulse stimulates the Purkinje fibers, making the ventricles contract, forcing the blood out at the top of the heart through via the aortic or pulmonary artery. Now we can move on to the autonomic influence on the cardiac cycle. This might sound confusing at first, but it is relatively straightforward. So one concept you need to understand is that all control systems for the cardiac system can be found in one part of the brain, called the medulla oblongata. Based on the action the person is doing, the sinoatrial node located in the right atrium needs to control the rate of the heart's contractions. It can do this because the cardiac control system located in the medulla oblongata sends an impulse down either the sympathetic nervous system, known as NCS, or the parasympathetic nervous system, known as PNS, to the sinoatrial node to make either the rate of the heart's contractions faster or slower, depending on what action the person is doing. If the impulse is sent down the SNS, this will speed up the rate of contractions because the impulse will travel through the accelerator nerve, which will stimulate the release of norepinephrine, which will increase the amount of the heart's contractions. However, if